Okay, we're ready now for the second half of our program, and our guest today is, for this half, is Tina Mitchell Boutall. I hope I pronounced that right. You can correct me if I didn't. She is a member of the DAR. She is also a researcher for Henry and Trimble counties for historical research and genealogy research. I met Tina on Facebook. We were in some groups together. Historical kinds of groups. So this is the first time I've actually seen her face to face, like in person, and not just a picture. So it's really nice to meet her today. Tina's story is a family story that it's a wild story, actually. So she had to set out to find out if this was true or not. Could she prove it? And would she include it in her family history? And this is about a child bride, to say the least. So I'm going to, at this point, have Tina start and have her tell you the background on this. Okay, Tina?
Oh, thank you, Fran, for having me and for giving my family a little moment. I appreciate you.
We're glad to
For
have
many years, thank you. For many years, we'd heard the tale that Granny Richard was kidnapped and sold for $100 to an old man. And of course, we never had anything but the story. So when it came to documenting my mother's genealogy, these are the kinds of questions, Fran, that come up when people say, did it really happen? What's your proof? Is that valid? So, and she was sort of a lady of mystery. Being a woman of humble origins, we know the more humble you are, the fewer records there seem to be for these people who weren't as affluent. In addition, she married a coal miner, and we know that coal companies kept most of the records. So unless that coal company is still in existence, we have gaps in the story. All of this, is falling under one name in my genealogy, right? She's just this big black hole of nothingness. So we're trying to document her. So we started 20 years ago, and it was just a brick wall that we couldn't cross. And I knew that the answer to a lot of other questions about her probably were lying in the details about this kidnapping, more about her life and her experience. It wasn't until I tapped into the obscure newspapers in the area. When we're researching, we always go to the larger publications.
Sure. Well, those are the ones online too. If you're doing an online research, it's hard to find those obscure papers online.
Right. So if I had one word of advice to anyone else that's listening for some clues or some tips on how they might be able to turn over the rock, look under the smaller rocks. Don't go for the boulders. Look in the obscure places. The key to my family mystery was in a small publication, a small newspaper in a neighboring town that had recorded that her grandmother, Mary Gray was my great grandmother, but this is her grandmother and her uncle looking for her. So that Mary Gray is missing. Aha, that Martha Gray, who is her, or Mary Ann Gray, who is her grandma, is come in town with Stephen Gray, and I know Stephen is absolutely her uncle, have come to look for little Mary, and they believe, and I won't give the name, but they believe this gentleman is the one who has abducted her. So there's a search for Mary. And then I had to piece together where she went in between, because I'm trying to validate this marriage license between her and my great grandfather. How did they meet? There's all these pieces that don't fit.
Let me back up and ask you, what made them think they knew this man had her? What led them to believe that?
I'm not exactly sure. They were living in a smaller part of town. I know that what they did is at that point in their lives, They were working in a small town called Marshall, and that was all about the sawmill industry.
Okay.
So, you know, it's hard scrabble life. I think it was basically that they had asked around and someone said, I think he took her, or he was the last person seen with her. But that's the information they give to the authorities. And it's also, you know, the article's really telling because grandma and uncle walk into town. There's no buggy. There's, you know, they are, you know, lower income people. They don't even have a car. And Mary's missing, and they're on foot looking for help because she's gone.
So what time frame is this? Because you're talking about a car, so 1900s then.
Yeah, it was 1898.
Okay, yeah.
And the wildness to the story for me is that we're so many years past the Civil War and slavery and all this, yet a story about human trafficking is still very much in this context of history. And I later on found out when I did more Eastern Kentucky research that there were similar stories of children that were taken. We just don't necessarily talk about the kidnappings.
Wow.
You know, and that people did, the money was the motivator. The man that abducted her didn't, you know, harm her in any way. She was a bargaining chip, and in 1898, $100 was a lot of money.
Sure.
So he sold her as a bride to an elderly gentleman.
Wow.
And there was some issue too, because apparently the marriage was quite legal.
Gosh.
So
you found a marriage license for them? Did you find a marriage bond or license? Oh, wow. Okay.
And it was tough because the surnames that I was working with were literally white, black, gray, and brown.
Oh no.
I'm not kidding.
Very common names.
Yes. White, black, gray, and brown.
And then with her name being a common first name too, that probably added to the difficulty.
Well, and so you can tell when we've got common names, it was really important to narrow down the location and make sure, is this my Mary? Is this my Mary Gray? Is this the right Stephen? Is this the right, you know, to make sure that all of these people fit into this scenario. Also getting into, you know, where she went afterwards. I had to do the same thing all over again in narrowing down, is this her? And it's taken 20 years. But
perseverance. You stuck with it.
Yeah. But yes, but again, I think it comes down to, you know, as you and I, because you dig just as much as I do, it comes down to knowing your sources and knowing how to use your sources.
Sure.
And for all the years that I'd researched, why didn't I look in the smaller papers? And I hate to say it, I hadn't thought of it.
Right.
You know, I'm
still
skimming the treetops.
Sure, we hear that kind of thing today, and it's big news. It's national news sometimes. And in those days, that just didn't happen that way sometimes. There was not a big national news type spreading.
Later on, I found out that there was this whole thing of selling brides. They were doing things like this and bringing brides from other countries. I mean, when we look at what was happening to Mary Gray in the context of history, was it a one-off? Well, it wasn't. There were stories in the national news about child brides and things of that nature, but the majority of them were coming from different countries, and they stopped it.
Yeah.
But
so you were able to prove the story was true. So at this point, that's kind of a delicate story. How much of it do you put out there in your genealogy research? Do you keep a public tree on Ancestry? And would you include, if you did, would you include that in your story?
Would I include it? Yes, I did include it. And then in the other, because this portion of my research, as far as Kentucky is concerned, covers Lewis and Greenup counties in Kentucky. Okay. And when I got brave and decided that I was going to share this story to gain more information, you know, I realized we kept it quiet for years, and I thought, you know, if I don't open up, I may not ever get all the answers.
Right.
And sure enough, because this marriage was quite legal, Mary did escape, but she was on the run for a while because she didn't want this man to find her. She'd legally married him. She was 12 years old. And
Wow.
yeah, so when she did meet my great grandfather, those were other questions that we needed to kind of fill in on the timeline and how all of this happened. As it was, so I decided to dip my toe in the water. I made the story public, and a woman who's also a member of the Lewis County Historical Society contacted me because she was related to the minister who hid Mary.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And yes, so I
Small
had
world
mentioned
there.
that, yes, I had mentioned Reverend William Wilburn, and she was literally in a wide spot in the road called Flat Hollow, Kentucky. And it's in Greenup County. And a woman by the name of Tiny Reister contacted me, and she said, Silas Wilburn was my great grandpa, and he lived to be 108. And she said, I was his little doodlebug, and he told me all kinds of stories. Well, she starts talking to me about my great grandfather who died in 1909.
Oh,
And I
wow.
couldn't believe it. Well, as it turns out, what's the key to Mary Gray there? Well, John Bloomfield became her husband, and he's my great grandfather. They had 3 children, only one survived, and that was my grandmother.
Wow.
And so, yeah, they lost 2 children. She lost her husband in a mine explosion, and it was just her and my grandma coming into Cincinnati in 1935. So, so much had happened by 1935. It was a little crazy.
Sure.
So, anyway, she tells me about the story, and she told me that her grandpa Silas had told them when they had helped John Wilbur go down the river to West Virginia with Mary. And sure enough, when I added up the dates and I found another article, my grandmother is with John, and she's 4 months pregnant, and they're going into the coal fields.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and so Tiny and her family invited me to their family reunion. So I actually got to meet the Wilburns.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, and the other connection too was that John's sister, how that all came about is that John's sister, Mary Ellen Bloomfield, married Basil Wilburn, who was Reverend William Wilburn's son. So the man who hid her pretty much introduced her to the man she would marry. And so I was so excited as a teeny, I was so excited because I thought, oh my goodness, I've really got the story. And Tiny connected me with more people in the Bloomfield line. I found out more information about John than I'd never had before. So to say all that, one article in an obscure paper it didn't just knock down a brick wall. It opened a world of opportunity.
Sure.
Distant cousins, friends, and connections that make all these stories make sense.
Yes. And genealogy is good for that.
Yes.
It's an incredible way to connect with people of like interest and to share information. You can learn so much.
Oh, absolutely. And I found out so much about the counties and, because I'd never been to Greenup. It's sad to say, but I'd never been to Greenup, and it comes up often in my mother's genealogy, but it wasn't something I'd explored. I'd been to Lewis many times, but not to Greenup, and it also reminded me that things that I said, well, maybe next summer, or maybe I'll look at that later. Sure. But if I wouldn't have met a lady with these marvelous stories that could also, that could bring life to the facts I was finding, I just found that invaluable. And we were able to go, yes, and she told me where the old church was, and I was able to drive down to Flat Hollow and see where the church was gone. There had been some kind of a disaster, and the church was no longer there, but I was able to go down into Flat Hollow and find out where she was in the years before she married John.
And that's really neat to get to do too.
Yes, and I think it connected me to it made me feel more of her experience. I think it gets you closer to your ancestors when you
Well, they become people and not numbers. Once you have a
exactly.
story and you can attach it to them, don't you think?
Exactly. Everything becomes so real.
Yes. So how did she know to get to the preacher? Was it just luck that she ran into him, or did she know him, or
No,
the preacher that married them?
No, there was a family connection there with the Gray side of the family.
Okay.
Reverend Wilburn operated the church that was just down the road from the farm of John and Susan Gray, and they were related, of course, to her mother's people.
Okay.
And so I think that it was more a function of, the Grays saying, where are we going to hide, or where's the best place to hide?
Okay.
And I think that their cousin John helped out with that. And then she just, I find her as a housekeeper when she's 16 years old in Reverend William Wilburn's house. And then shortly after that, she married John. So it looks to me like she's, earning her keep. They're finding someone that can, of course, protect her. And that's how she meets her husband. And then, of course, when she met John, they went to the coal fields and my grandmother was born. And so all these puzzle pieces just came together instead of, I had a 10-year gap between, well, actually 8 years. What happens to Mary from age 12 and then when she gets married? There's these 8 years between 12 and 20. I couldn't explain. And, as genealogists, we want to fill all those gaps
sure.
in.
Sure, we do.
And wow, what a story in those 8 years.
Right. Okay. Anything else you want to add, or any pointers you want to give when looking for the those obscure stories? Any advice you would give besides look in the newspapers and persevere?
People, yeah, exactly. Never give up. But in addition to looking in those obscure papers, I took that step in faith and I told my story. And there was someone out there who had the other piece. And while she didn't have the entire piece, she had a chunk large enough that I could take a bite and move forward. And everything else, she also put me in touch with others. So don't forget to collaborate. Be a little transparent. This is history, and we don't know how our history impacts another researcher and someone else's story. And after all, we're all just trying to get the story. So don't be afraid to be open. And I look at the story now, and I don't know, it makes me warm and it makes me proud, because what I learned is that Mary Gray was one tough little girl. And I'm just incredibly proud of her. She had strength, and I think that tells me also something about myself.
Sure.
So I'm really proud to be her great-granddaughter. She was tough.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah. And it's, I know with myself, I have a few tough grandmothers too. And it's always nice to think about when I'm thinking, oh, I can't do this. I can't go through this. I can't, I'm just not going to get to the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. I think, oh yeah, you will. They did.
Oh,
I keep telling myself.
Absolutely. Because we're only here because they made it.
Sure.
And telling their story is an honor.
Yes.
So I'm really glad I got the opportunity to share it with you.
Oh, I'm glad you did too. We're really glad to have you tonight. And we thank you so much for being part of this. For the viewers, this is going to be on YouTube for the next, it's going to be on there indefinitely. So you can view it at any time. Next month, second Saturday of the month, which is, let me see, what's the date? The 10th will be our next program. So we hope to see you then. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Fran. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tina.
Bye-bye.
And bye.